How does one become the head of one of history's biggest drug trafficking networks? How do you then escape with what would be over $100 million today and vanish without a trace? It seems only Frank Matthews ever figured that out. The DEA ranks him among the top 10 drug traffickers in U.S. history. Frank Matthews' story is incredible, yet surprisingly few people know about it. Operating out of Brooklyn in the 60s and 70s, this young African-American gangster, still in his 20s, was indeed at the helm of one of the largest criminal empires the world had ever seen. His estimated fortune was $300 million, which translates to a staggering $2 billion today. This colossal wealth was amassed through the sale of heroin and cocaine across the entire eastern United States. His network operated entirely independent of mafia control, an extremely rare feat for an African-American gangster, or frankly, any American gangster. By breaking free from the mob, Matthews surpassed not only his predecessor, Harlem Godfather Bumpy Johnson, but also out-earned Frank Lucas, the heroin trafficker popularized in the film American Gangster. Yet, again, few people seem to know this. Perhaps Hollywood wasn't keen on immortalizing a criminal who actually beat the system.
Can you really imagine a gangster movie where the bad girides of into the sunset with all the money?
That's precisely what Frank Matthews did in 1973, right when he was scheduled to appear in court. He simply vanished from the face of the earth, taking his girlfriend and over $100 million in today's money with him. It was a surreal and utterly enigmatic end to his criminal career. In short, Matthews is a mysterious figure whose story definitely deserves a closer look. So, get ready to dive into one of the most overlooked and intriguing unsolved cases of recent decades. Young and ambitious. Frank Matthews' life is, to put it mildly, a profound mystery. Even more so is his youth, about which very little is truly known. The reason for this obscurity lies in the numerous contradictory accounts from people who supposedly knew him. Ricky Johnson, a native of Durham, North Carolina, where Frank Matthews was from, described the difficulty of finding reliable information. Another resident of the city shared a similar sentiment, saying the people who really knew Matthews remained silent. As one person from Durham who claimed to know Frank put it, anyone who talks about Frank has only heard stories, as those who really knew him kept their mouths shut. Piecing together a clear picture of Frank's youth isn't easy. Still, a few pieces of information allow us to learn more about his early years. Frank Larry Matthews was born in Durham, North Carolina, on February 13, 1944, into a family he would hardly know. Nothing is known about his father. His mother died when he was barely 4 years old. Young Matthews was then raised by his aunt, who took him in and treated him like her own son. He grew up in Durham's poorest neighborhood, though the city itself was known at the time for housing one of the most prosperous black communities in the country, despite segregation. One Durham native and friend of Matthews recalled that many of the city's black leaders and entrepreneurs lived there, serving as role models. This likely fueled Frank's ambitions, inspired no doubt by Durham's thriving black entrepreneurs. Al Bradley, an author who extensively researched Frank's life, commented that Frank came of age during a time when black people were actively seeking to establish their own businesses and enterprises, and he was determined to make his mark. Frank began asserting himself from an early age among his classmates and the boys in his neighborhood. He appeared to be a natural-born leader, someone other kids wanted to follow. Those who knew him as a child often used the same two words to describe him: strong and charismatic. These qualities would later allow Frank to compete with New York's most ruthless gangsters. School, however, was a different story. Frank wasn't serious and seemed uninterested in his studies. He preferred the streets, an environment where he felt right at home. It's no surprise then that he dropped out of school at a young age. All he wanted was to make money, as one of his childhood friends remembered, saying that Frank was always hustling. He was a schemer, yes, but also capable of generosity toward those he cared for. However, you wouldn't want to cross him, as he could turn violent, another peer pointed out. Still, he could also be distant and reserved, another friend revealed, stating Frank often kept his feelings to himself and could be hard to read. As a teenager, he became the leader of a gang involved in various minor offenses, including a chicken theft from a local farm that led to his arrest at age 14. Later, he enrolled in barber school but only stayed a few months. According to a Durham native, this was because Frank had been caught stealing barber supplies. However, that same person also mentioned that Frank was driven by an overwhelming desire for wealth and saw barbering as too slow a path to riches. Frank did indeed leave his hometown of Durham in the early 60s, determined to get rich. Still a teenager, he headed northeast to pursue his dreams of fortune, initially making his way to Philadelphia. He stayed there for about a year, working as a barber and collecting numbers for an illegal gambling racket. This illegal activity, widespread at the time and often involving corrupt police officers, led Frank to meet other ambitious young individuals who, like him, were eager to get rich. But as mentioned, Frank didn't stay long in Philadelphia, and in 1963, or perhaps 1964, he left for New York. This was an entirely logical move, according to Roger Garay, a police inspector who investigated Matthews, who said that New York was where the real money was, especially for someone with ambition. Frank then settled in Brooklyn and continued his Philadelphia routine, working as a barber while organizing illegal bets. He continued this for some time, before growing tired of the numbers racket and turning to a more profitable venture, drug trafficking. Frank quickly observed that the black drug traffickers in his neighborhood were raking in serious cash. It didn't take him long to decide to follow the same path, as Inspector Roger Garay pointed out, stating that Frank simply saw a clear path to getting rich. In the 60s and 70s, one illicit substance was spreading like wildfire in New York City: heroin. This drug created a true epidemic at the time, fueling violence and disorder within black communities. A former city police officer remembered this chaos, stating that heroin was everywhere, and it was destroying lives. Frank seized the opportunity. To enter the booming drug trade, he had no choice but to contact the criminal organization that controlled the supply and distribution of heroin throughout New York, the powerful Cosa Nostra.
Drug baron.
During the 1960s, the drug trade on the east coast of the United States, especially within black communities, was tightly controlled by New York's 5 major mafia families: the Gambino, Lucchese, Bonanno, Genovese, formerly Luciano, and Colombo, formerly Prophesy. This traffic was, for a time, dominated by Jewish gangsters, particularly Arnold Rothstein, an organized crime figure who, as early as the 1920s, had grasped the full lucrative potential of this illicit trade, helping to organize and expand it across Uncle Sam's country. Then, in the 1930s, the Italian mafia, looking to diversify after Prohibition, joined the Jewish mob in narcotics trafficking, eventually monopolizing the market by the following decade. After World War II, the heroin trafficked by the mafia was imported from Italian refineries. These refineries shut down after the Italian government banned heroin manufacturing in the early 1950s. With no other option, the mafia sought new supply sources, leading to the birth of the French Connection. This involved setting up an even more sophisticated smuggling network where opium was cultivated in Turkey, sent to France for processing in clandestine labs, and then distributed across the United States. This network, which thrived throughout the 50s and 60s, allowed the American mafia to continue drug trafficking throughout the U.S. and in New York. To break into this market and sell his first kilos of heroin, Frank Matthews had to go through the Cosa Nostra. He tried to partner with the Gambino and Bonanno families, but for one reason or another, they rejected his proposal. Many would have been deterred by this refusal, but not Frank. He was young, ambitious, and absolutely determined to make his mark in the drug trade. So he persisted until he found another opportunity. That opportunity came from Spanish Raymond Marquez, an acquaintance of Frank's known at the time as the king of the Harlem numbers game. In other words, he was a big deal. Marquez had connections and leveraged them for Frank, putting him in touch with a Cuban gangster named Rolando González Núñez, a major cocaine supplier who, in the 60s, was one of New York's biggest coke dealers before having to flee to Venezuela due to legal troubles. Frank connected with Rolando, and the deal was sealed. He bought his first kilo of cocaine for $20,000. This relationship quickly blossomed into a lucrative and expansive drug trafficking network. The Cuban trafficker regularly sent him large shipments of cocaine and heroin from South America, while Frank developed his business by reselling the product in New York. It didn't take him long to establish himself. Within just 1 year, he became one of the city's biggest drug dealers. His rise was meteoric. At the time, Venezuela was one of the Latin American countries where the Cosa Nostra had established itself. For drug traffickers, it was a strategic location, particularly due to its geographical proximity to the United States. It was an ideal base, which the French Connection used to transport its heroin to Latin America and then distribute it in Miami, one of the main entry points for drug trafficking into the U.S. Corsican gangsters, with their ability to infiltrate and corrupt governments, handled the drugs transport to Venezuela. From there, Cubans sent the heroin to the United States, where it was then distributed throughout the country, notably in New York. Thanks to his collaboration with the French Connection and the Cubans, Frank had become one of the city's largest distributors. His network with the French Connection and the Cubans was highly profitable, though Frank knew he needed to diversify. To do so, he went searching for new supply sources, ready to do business with anyone, as long as the product was pure enough. Donald Goddard, an author who investigated Frank's criminal career, noted that Frank was focused on finding the best product, unlike the mafia, who often sold whatever they had, regardless of quality. Ultimately, Frank did the exact opposite of the Cosa Nostra, who sold their drugs at exorbitant prices without regard for product quality. His network quickly expanded even further, supplying drugs to nearly 21 different states, particularly across the east coast of the United States. He never reached California, but over time, he could have certainly reigned over the entire country, as reported by William Callahan, a U.S. federal prosecutor, who stated Matthews could have been the king of narcotics in the United States. The profits Frank Matthews made from heroin and cocaine trafficking were nothing short of astonishing. It said he was pulling in up to $600,000 a day, with his fortune nearing $300 million, the equivalent of $2 billion today. He reportedly amassed this wealth in just 4 years. According to Liddy Jones, a former associate of Frank's, no New York gangster at the time was earning more money than him. Jones even recalled a time when Frank received a phone call, then excused himself to answer a knock at the door, only to return with a suitcase full of cash, casually stating that it was just $1 million. 5 years after arriving in New York, Frank Matthews had become the city's biggest drug baron, barely in his 20s. He had built his own drug trafficking network, operating entirely independent of the mafia, which was a remarkable achievement for an African-American gangster. Early in his criminal career, Frank Matthews was quite discreet about his lifestyle. He lived in a modest apartment and didn't seem to splurge, as recalled by Rick Talley, a former New York drug trafficker who knew Frank in the late 60s, describing Matthews as always being quiet, never flashing money around. However, as his drug empire grew, Frank began to embrace an entirely different persona. He dressed in expensive clothes, a cigar often in his mouth, and drove luxurious cars, often seen with beautiful women. He later traded his modest apartment for a mansion in New York's affluent Todt Hill neighborhood. This area was known at the time for housing some of the city's biggest mobsters, including Big Paul Castellano, the future head of the Gambino family, whose house was directly across from Frank's mansion. Certain members of the Lucchese family also lived there, and Frank was the only black resident in the exclusive area. Lou Rice, a DEA agent, elaborated on this, saying that Matthews essentially moved into the mafia's backyard, making a bold statement. Beyond his wealth, Frank was a heavy cocaine user, if not an outright addict. Donald Goddard, an author who looked into his life, recounted that Matthews consumed large quantities of cocaine, using it day and night. William Callahan, the federal prosecutor who investigated the Matthews case, added that Matthews had developed a serious cocaine habit, often staying awake for days at a time. Yet, this addiction didn't stop him from continuing to expand his empire and accumulate even more money. Al Bradley, another author who studied his life, stated that Matthews was a visionary who aimed to build an organization comparable to the biggest criminal enterprises, seeing himself as an equal to legendary figures. One could indeed compare Frank to Luciano and Escobar in the sense that, like them, he was the organizer and master of ceremonies for summits among crime bosses. One such summit took place in Atlanta in October 1971, where he invited the nation's biggest African-American and Hispanic drug traffickers to improve heroin and cocaine distribution. The other was in Las Vegas the following year, during the Muhammad Ali vs. Jerry Quarry fight. At that meeting, similar topics were discussed, such as the need to establish stronger independent relationships with the Corsican and Cuban mafias to break free from Italian-American mafia control. Of course, the DEA was aware of these summits, particularly the one in Atlanta, where agents were present. An American anti-drug agent recounted that they saw many individuals with suitcases entering and leaving, and they knew something significant was happening. It was then that authorities began to take a much closer look at him. Las Vegas was a city Frank Matthews frequented, much like many other drug traffickers, drawn to its legalized gambling. Matthews would go there to gamble, enjoy himself, and also to launder his money, as federal prosecutor William Callahan noted that Matthews was a master at laundering his illicit gains through the city's casinos. What's strange then is that authorities didn't even have him on their radar. Frank Matthews had grown illegally rich and ascended to the top of the underworld, yet no one in law enforcement seemed to be aware. Callahan remembered that for a long time, Matthews remained completely off their radar. In fact, it wasn't until shortly after the Las Vegas summit in 1972 that police finally began wiretapping him. A dedicated investigation unit, dubbed Group 12, then seriously focused on his case. Its goal was to find a way to indict drug lord Frank Matthews. Among the investigators were William Callahan, whose role was to coordinate the inquiry, and Gerard Miller, a narcotics agent with 20 years of experience in organized crime cases. Group 12's task was to gather all evidence that could prove Matthews' involvement in drug trafficking. This was no easy feat, considering Frank's only recorded criminal offense was a minor chicken theft. Gerard Miller, in particular, couldn't fathom how such an influential drug trafficker had eluded law enforcement's vigilance for so long. Nor could he understand how an African American in his 20s could conduct operations in nearly 21 states across the country. The situation left agents perplexed. Miller found it bewildering, remarking that it was simply unheard of. The investigation was difficult to conduct, especially as Group 12 faced intense pressure from their superiors for results. And the lack of resources at their disposal didn't help matters. The agents had only 3 months to produce something significant, which was very little time, especially for cornering a gangster of Matthews' caliber. In reality, it would have taken several years of investigation to achieve conclusive results. But Gerard Miller and his colleagues did their best with the means they had. It was thanks to their efforts that Frank Matthews' phone calls began to be wiretapped in 1972. American anti-drug authorities then provided their support to the case, followed by the intervention of Interpol and the U.S. Internal Revenue Service, with whom Group 12 worked closely to prosecute the drug lord. Together, they successfully located and seized assets belonging to Frank, including several properties. Investigators then tried to tail his car whenever they could, but Frank was always faster than them, constantly escaping while breaking every possible traffic law. It's possible Frank was under the influence of cocaine during these chases, or perhaps he knew in advance he was being watched, as corruption was widespread within the New York City police force at the time. In any case, it wasn't worth continuing. Gerard Miller eventually decided the risk wasn't worth it, concluding it wasn't prudent to endanger agents' lives in reckless pursuits. He once opened the trunk of his car in broad daylight, pulled out kilos of drugs, and handed them to an individual for all to see. It was as if he couldn't care less if law enforcement was watching him. But it was only a matter of time before things turned in the investigators' favor. In the early 70s, Frank Matthews' network continued to supply illegal substances across the United States, generating millions of dollars in revenue. Group 12, meanwhile, made progress in the investigation, to the point of inflicting the first damages on the drug lord's empire. It started with the arrest of several of his associates. Arrests continued over time, sometimes leading to informants providing Group 12 with more and more information to bolster their case. After a year of investigation, authorities finally had solid evidence to bring Frank Matthews down. All that remained was to arrest him. The arrest took place on January 5, 1973, at 11 a.m. Frank was at Las Vegas International Airport with his girlfriend, about to board a flight to Los Angeles, when authorities intercepted him and put him in handcuffs. Sometime earlier, they had obtained an arrest warrant for tax fraud and drug trafficking conspiracy, as Matthews had attempted, between April and September 1972, to sell 18 kilograms of cocaine in Miami, with an estimated value of $1 to $4.5 million. Drug lord Frank Matthews was finally arrested. All that remained was to await his trial, scheduled for 7 months later. At the bail hearing, which occurred the day after his arrest, Frank displayed a certain arrogance toward William Callahan, who recalled that Matthews carried himself with an air of absolute untouchability, as if he simply didn't care. He seemed confident, but he would quickly change his tune upon hearing the bail amount set by the magistrate, $5 million. It was the highest bail in U.S. history at the time, a sum chosen due to the significant risk of Frank Matthews fleeing and the vast fortune he possessed. This bail was subsequently lowered to $2.5 million after Frank agreed not to oppose his extradition to New York. Then, it was reduced again to $325,000, a ridiculous sum for a drug lord of Matthews' stature, who, unsurprisingly, seized the opportunity to regain his freedom. Yes, Frank Matthews was now free before the trial. It was a mistake that the American justice system would bitterly regret, as the young gangster wouldn't wait long to make his escape. Frank Matthews had disappeared. Frank had regained his freedom and was once again at the head of his criminal organization. For investigators, it was difficult to keep an eye on him before the trial. Police Inspector Roger Garay admitted they could only hope Matthews would show up for trial. Hope was indeed all the police had, because ultimately, nothing prevented Frank Matthews from packing his bags and disappearing with his entire fortune. It must be said that he was facing a life sentence, and anyway, the heroin market was becoming increasingly unstable due to the gradual dismantling of the French Connection. So, given that situation, nothing prevented him from fleeing. And that's precisely what happened on July 2, 1973, when the defendant Frank Larry Matthews failed to appear for the trial that was supposed to send him to prison. The drug lord had vanished, declared a fugitive the day after his trial.
So, what had happened?
Well, some sources claim that Frank said his goodbyes to friends and distributed part of his fortune before disappearing permanently. One source recounted that Matthews quietly informed a few people he was leaving for good. Reggie Collins, a drug trafficker at the time, claimed to have been one of the last friends Frank saw before he slipped away. Frank Matthews apparently fled, but not alone, it seems, as his mistress, Cheryl Denise Brown, was also nowhere to be found. She had vanished at the same time as Matthews, suggesting the two fled together. Authorities also claimed that Frank Matthews laundered up to $20 million to prepare his escape, very likely leaving the country. $20 million at that time represents over $100 million today, quite a fortune. A reward of $20,000 was then offered by the DEA for any information leading to his capture. It was the highest reward offered since that for John Dillinger in 1931. Authorities distributed thousands of wanted notices across the country, leading to numerous calls from people claiming to have seen the fugitive. Unfortunately, these leads went nowhere. But the hunt for Frank Matthews intensified, and the DEA searched for him worldwide, confident they would capture him one day. Glenn Chisholm, one of the investigators involved in the search, affirmed their determination to find him, no matter where he went. However, it was learned that thanks to Interpol, collaborating with American authorities on the case, Frank Matthews was sighted in Rome, then Amsterdam, and other European cities. Perhaps Frank Matthews was in Europe? According to reports about him, it's entirely possible, but it was also probable he was in Africa, Bermuda, the Bahamas, Venezuela, Philadelphia, Chicago, the North Carolina countryside, or perhaps even Hong Kong. Yes, that's a lot of places, and the problem was there was practically no useful intelligence in the files or actual leads to locate him. However, some locations were more plausible than others. Like the Bahamas, where the fugitive owned property. Paraguay, known at the time for harboring the largest number of escaped criminals. Or Algeria, the ideal country for a fugitive in the 70s, given that relations between Algeria and the United States were not very good at the time, and there was no extradition treaty between the two nations. Investigators therefore hoped he wasn't there, because he would have been, let's say, almost impossible to capture. The investigation group tasked with finding Matthews received hundreds of leads from around the world. It felt like Matthews could be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Extracting information from interrogated individuals was also very difficult. Glenn Chisholm, an investigator on the case, found that no one, not even Matthews' closest associates, was willing to talk about him. Oddly, no one seemed willing to provide information on Frank Matthews. Investigators then interviewed other people, such as Barbara Hinton, Matthews' former wife, with whom he had 3 children. Glenn Chisholm recalled that she was very guarded and offered little useful information. Al Parrish, Chisholm's colleague on the Frank Matthews case, also expressed his frustration, noting it was clear she knew more than she let on but simply wouldn't budge. The Frank Matthews trail thinned as time went on. Investigators Glenn Chisholm and Al Parrish, who worked on the case, were quite critical of Gerard Miller, the man who had led Group 12, the unit responsible for indicting Matthews. Yes, because in their opinion, Miller had done a poor job, thinking he knew everything about Frank when the reports on him were actually quite scarce. Moreover, upon reviewing the files, investigators noted that at one point, Frank Matthews had been willing to cooperate with authorities, provided some of his men were left alone. Miller reportedly refused this proposition, which made no sense. Al Parrish considered it a major tactical error, suggesting it was a missed opportunity to gain valuable intelligence. Regardless, the investigators continued their work. This brings us to January 28, 1974, the day Glenn Chisholm and Al Parrish went to Madison Square Garden in New York to attend the second fight between Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier. Their goal: to corner Frank Matthews, a die-hard Muhammad Ali fan. The two investigators had indeed been informed that Frank had undergone plastic surgery to alter his features and thus pass incognito. Glenn Chisholm remembered that they were looking for someone who looked different, but they had no idea just how much his appearance might have changed. That day, at least 20,000 people attended the legendary fight. The agents arrived early to observe the incoming crowd, attempting to take photos, but there was nothing. Not a single sign of Frank Matthews. It was another failure. A year passed, and the investigation group, which included Glenn Chisholm and Al Parrish, had not advanced an inch. It turned out that investigators had spent an enormous amount of time searching for clues, examining the slightest evidence, traveling across the United States and abroad to follow potential leads, only to find very little in the end. Ultimately, they knew as much about Matthews' disappearance at the end as they did at the beginning. This stalemate prompted the DEA to dissolve the investigation group. Glenn Chisholm expressed profound frustration, stating it was incredibly disheartening to pour so much effort into the case and come up completely empty-handed. The investigation was then handed over to the U.S. Marshals, who started the file from scratch, given the scarcity of information on the fugitive. But there too, over time, leads became increasingly rare. The DEA, which had kept the Matthews file open and continued the search, saw a new generation of agents arrive in the following decades. While they knew about Frank, they had other priorities. This was indeed the era of major Colombian and Mexican drug traffickers who monopolized the attention of American authorities, and the Frank Matthews case was no longer a DEA priority. The U.S. Marshals therefore took over the case and tried to locate him in turn, but it was always the same scenario, nothing concrete. Mike Peasy, a U.S. Marshal who supervised the Matthews investigation, recalled that they tried everything, following every lead, but it felt like chasing a ghost. This frontal strategy had its limits, as Dave O'Flaherty, also a U.S. Marshal, acknowledged the limitations, stating that you couldn't just kick down doors and expect to find someone who was determined to stay hidden. The U.S. Marshals continued searching, then took a closer look at the 3 sons Frank had left behind. That's when they learned that one of them was in prison for car theft. This was surprising, given that Frank was known to be a good father. Yet, to go from a caring father to a heartless one was still strange. Mike Peasy's suspicion grew, leading him to wonder if Matthews had truly abandoned his children, or if something more sinister had occurred. Had he voluntarily cut ties with his loved ones to ensure an effective escape? If so, it was surprising. What if, in the end, Frank Matthews was dead? Certainly, no trace of fingerprints or his body has been found, but there are theories that point in this direction. Many people interviewed by investigators indeed claimed that Frank Matthews was no longer in this world. Deborah Nightwine, a U.S. Marshal who spent over 5 years on the case, personally believed he was dead, suggesting that if he were still alive, some evidence would have surfaced by now. Mike Peasy also subscribed to this theory, arguing that someone of his stature, with that much money, couldn't simply disappear without someone knowing. But if Frank Matthews was dead, what happened to him? Seth Ferranti, an author who studied Frank's life, had his own theory. He believed the mafia killed him. This is a plausible theory, in the sense that Frank didn't like the mafia, and the mafia didn't like him either. Indeed, it is known, first of all, that some New York mobsters did not appreciate Frank's arrival in Toad Hill. Gerard Miller explained that the mobsters weren't pleased to have an African-American moving into their exclusive neighborhood. Mob boss Paul Castellano reportedly even wanted to eliminate Frank, as indicated by police, who allegedly overheard him during a wiretap. Matthews took this death threat seriously and subsequently tried to arrange a meeting with Big Paul. Then, there was the time Frank Matthews kidnapped an associate of the Genovese family to get revenge on another family associate who had cheated him in a drug deal. This was a completely reckless and insane act that could also have led the mafia to eliminate him. So, Frank Matthews eliminated by the mafia? Yes, that's entirely probable. But it's also possible he died of a cocaine overdose, given his known strong addiction to the drug and his heart problems. Or one might believe this other assassination theory. A theory involving Matthews, the CIA, the Corsicans and Venezuela. Yes, because it is said that at the time, Frank reportedly jeopardized the Corsican drug trafficking network in Venezuela. Group 12, which was investigating Frank at the time, had obtained wiretaps where Frank was heard revealing information about this connection, which subsequently allowed authorities to dismantle the network. This incident would have enraged the Corsicans, who pointed fingers at Matthews, designating him as the main cause of this enormous financial loss. The fact that the Corsicans had to change their supply route to Miami may have thus prompted them to want to eliminate Frank. The CIA too, for that matter, which had interests in the region. Federal prosecutor William Callahan, who investigated Frank, elaborated, pointing out that the CIA maintained a presence in the region and would not have tolerated anyone disrupting their operations. So, there was the Corsican Mafia on one side and the CIA on the other, both of whom had a grudge against Frank. 2 major entities that would have had no trouble making him disappear without a trace. Mike Peasy of the U.S. Marshals leaned toward this theory, considering it the most logical explanation given how many powerful people Frank had angered. So, was Frank Matthews assassinated? Unfortunately, we can only speculate about this possibility. Rumors added to other rumors only deepen the mystery of Frank Matthews. Some believe he is dead, others that he is still alive and pulled off the greatest disappearance in crime history. What is certain is that as the years pass, it becomes less and less probable that the truth about this story will ever be discovered. The story of a drug lord who, overnight, vanished from the face of the earth without a trace. What ultimately happened to Frank Matthews after his disappearance? That is a question that, I fear, will forever remain unanswered.